High-functioning anxiety is one of the most convincing disguises psychological distress can wear, because from the outside, it rarely looks like suffering at all. It looks like success. It looks like the person who always arrives early, answers emails immediately, remembers every detail, and somehow manages to hold everything together while everyone else is falling behind. Society praises these people constantly. Their ambition becomes admirable. Their perfectionism becomes professionalism. Their inability to stop working becomes dedication. But underneath the polished surface, something very different is happening internally. The nervous system is not operating from peace, confidence, or stability. It is operating from fear. Every task feels loaded with invisible consequences. Every mistake feels dangerous. Every delay feels like proof of inadequacy waiting to be exposed. What other people interpret as discipline is often a mind trapped in permanent fight-or-flight mode, using productivity as emotional survival. The overachievement is not always driven by passion. Many times it is driven by terror. Terror of disappointing people. Terror of losing control. Terror of slowing down long enough to feel the exhaustion underneath everything. High-functioning anxiety survives because the world rewards the symptoms instead of recognizing the suffering behind them. The person drowning internally still gets praised for being reliable. The person running on chronic stress still gets promoted for working harder than everyone else. And because the external results appear impressive, even the person experiencing the anxiety often mistakes survival for thriving. They convince themselves that the constant tension is simply what motivation feels like, that exhaustion is normal, that worth must always be earned through performance. Over time, the anxiety becomes fused with identity itself. The fear no longer feels separate from the personality. It feels like the engine holding life together. But a nervous system forced to operate at emergency speed every day eventually pays a price for surviving this way, even when the outside world continues applauding the performance. One of the clearest signs of high-functioning anxiety is how preparation slowly stops feeling useful and starts feeling necessary for emotional survival. From the outside, it looks impressive. The detailed calendars, color-coded schedules, backup plans, carefully rehearsed conversations, and endless mental checklists create the image of someone highly organized and responsible. But internally, the emotional experience is very different. The preparation is not creating peace. It is attempting to prevent disaster. Every possible mistake gets mentally simulated in advance because the anxious nervous system believes control is the only protection against humiliation, rejection, failure, or chaos. Productivity becomes emotional armor. If every variable can be anticipated, maybe nothing painful will happen. Maybe no one will see the insecurity underneath the competence. This is why high-functioning anxiety often creates obsessive over-preparation. The person is not calmly planning for success. They are desperately negotiating with fear. Their mind treats uncertainty like danger, and preparation becomes the ritual used to temporarily quiet the threat response. Even small tasks become loaded with invisible emotional consequences because failure never feels neutral. It feels personal. This same fear-based control appears strongly in the relationship high-functioning anxious people have with time itself. They are rarely simply punctual. They arrive excessively early, not because they enjoy waiting, but because lateness triggers shame far beyond the actual situation. Sitting in a parking lot 20 minutes before an appointment, constantly checking the clock, mentally rehearsing explanations for hypothetical delays, this is not ordinary responsibility. It is anticipatory anxiety disguised as discipline. A 1-minute delay can create a disproportionate panic response because internally, the nervous system interprets small mistakes as evidence of worthlessness or failure. Other people see reliability. The anxious mind feels danger. This is why many high-functioning anxious individuals wake up before their alarms with their thoughts already racing. Their bodies are flooded with cortisol before the day even begins. The productivity they feel proud of is often driven less by motivation and more by hyperarousal. Their nervous system is preparing for battle before anything has actually happened. Over time, they begin confusing anxiety with drive itself. The adrenaline becomes familiar. The tension feels productive. And because society rewards overworking, overpreparing, and hyper-responsibility so aggressively, very few people recognize the fear underneath these behaviors, including the person living them. But eventually, the preparation stops feeling empowering and starts feeling exhausting. The person realizes they are not planning because they feel secure. They are planning because they are terrified of what might happen if they ever stop trying to control everything. One of the most exhausting parts of high-functioning anxiety is that it often disguises itself as kindness. The person becomes known as dependable, helpful, generous, and endlessly available. They say yes automatically, yes to extra work, yes to favors, yes to emotional labor nobody else wants to carry. From the outside, this looks admirable. But internally, the yes is often driven less by genuine capacity and more by fear. Fear of disappointing people, fear of being disliked, fear that saying no will expose them as selfish, lazy, difficult, or unworthy of love. Over time, helpfulness becomes emotionally fused with safety itself. The anxious mind quietly learns that usefulness protects belonging. If they are valuable enough, productive enough, accommodating enough, then maybe rejection will never arrive. This creates the yes reflex, where agreement happens automatically before the person even checks whether they actually have the emotional energy to give. And because they perform this role so well, other people often assume they are naturally capable of carrying endless responsibility. What nobody sees is the constant emotional calculation happening underneath the surface. High-functioning anxious people are often in a near-permanent state of social scanning. They monitor facial expressions, pauses in conversation, text response times, changes in tone, body language, and emotional atmosphere continuously. Tiny signals that most people barely notice become loaded with emotional meaning. A delayed reply suddenly feels threatening. A slightly different tone feels like hidden disappointment. An unread message becomes evidence that something is wrong. Their nervous system constantly searches for signs of rejection or disapproval because it believes emotional safety depends on staying ahead of other people's reactions. This hypervigilance becomes mentally exhausting, but it also becomes automatic. They often do not even realize how much invisible emotional labor they are performing every day simply to maintain the appearance of being okay. Over time, the emotional cost becomes impossible to ignore. The constant performance creates resentment they feel guilty for having. They begin noticing how empty they feel after endlessly supporting everyone else while silently neglecting themselves. The competence everyone admires slowly turns into a mask hiding chronic exhaustion. They continue functioning beautifully on the outside while internally feeling emotionally frayed, detached, and depleted. And because they are still succeeding professionally, socially, or academically, very few people recognize the seriousness of what is happening beneath the surface. Even the anxious person themselves may believe they are simply stressed, instead of understanding that their nervous system has been trapped in survival mode for years. This is the hidden tragedy of high-functioning anxiety. The world keeps rewarding the performance while quietly ignoring the person collapsing underneath it. At some point, high-functioning anxiety stops looking like ambition and starts feeling like collapse happening in slow motion. The person is still performing, still achieving, still answering emails and meeting deadlines, but internally, the nervous system is beginning to fail under the weight of constant pressure. One of the clearest signs appears in the relationship they develop with rest itself. Relaxation no longer feels peaceful. It feels threatening. Sitting still creates guilt instead of recovery. Free time becomes emotionally uncomfortable because the anxious mind has fused worth with usefulness so completely that doing nothing feels dangerous. Psychologists call this relaxation-induced anxiety. The nervous system becomes so accustomed to operating in constant alert mode that silence and stillness start feeling unfamiliar, even unsafe. The person cannot simply watch a movie, take a walk, or rest without feeling the need to multitask, optimize, or remain productive somehow. Achievement slowly stops being something they do and becomes the entire structure holding their identity together. Without productivity, they no longer know how to measure their value. This creates a brutal internal cycle. The more exhausted they become, the harder they push themselves to compensate for the exhaustion. But eventually, the body begins demanding attention in ways impossible to ignore. The jaw remains clenched long after stressful moments end. Breathing becomes shallow and tight without them noticing. Headaches become normal. Digestive problems appear. Sleep loses its restorative quality. The body stays flooded with stress hormones for so long that chronic exhaustion begins feeling like a permanent personality trait instead of a warning sign. And because they are still technically functioning, both they and the people around them often mistake survival for health. This is one of the cruelest aspects of high-functioning anxiety. A person can be deeply unwell while continuing to appear highly capable. Their suffering becomes invisible precisely because they are still performing effectively. But underneath the competence, another problem quietly grows: perfection paralysis. The fear of failing becomes so intense that even beginning tasks can feel emotionally overwhelming. Projects are delayed not from laziness, but because the possibility of imperfection feels psychologically unbearable. The nervous system no longer works toward growth or fulfillment. It works toward avoiding shame, avoiding criticism, avoiding collapse. Over time, functioning itself becomes confused with well-being. The person tells themselves they must be okay because they are still managing responsibilities. But surviving constantly at emergency speed is not the same thing as living peacefully. And eventually, the body and mind begin forcing the truth into awareness whether the person is ready to face it or not. Healing from high-functioning anxiety does not begin with becoming more productive, more disciplined, or better at controlling yourself. It begins with the painful realization that your worth was never supposed to depend on constant performance in the first place. For many people with high-functioning anxiety, achievement slowly became emotional survival. Being useful felt safe. Being needed felt valuable. Staying busy prevented the terrifying silence where self-doubt could finally be heard clearly. The mask of competence was not vanity, it was protection. It helped you survive environments where mistakes felt dangerous, where slowing down felt unsafe, and where love or approval seemed connected to how much you could accomplish for others. But survival strategies are not meant to become permanent identities. And eventually, the nervous system reaches a point where constant functioning stops feeling sustainable. Healing begins when awareness replaces autopilot. The moment you notice your body tightening after an unanswered message, the moment you recognize perfectionism as fear rather than excellence, the moment you understand that anxiety is not a personality trait to optimize, but a nervous system asking for safety, rest, and compassion. This is why healing is not about eliminating anxiety perfectly. That simply becomes another performance. Instead, it is about changing your relationship with the anxiety itself, learning that rest is not something earned only after exhaustion, learning that boundaries are not selfish, learning that saying no does not make you unlovable. Slowly, the nervous system begins discovering that the world does not collapse when you stop over-functioning for everyone around you. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is this: your value exists independently of what you produce. You do not become more worthy by suffering more efficiently. You do not need to constantly prove your usefulness to deserve care, connection, or peace. The person underneath the productivity was always enough long before the achievements arrived. And maybe healing finally begins the moment you stop treating yourself like a machine built only for output and start allowing yourself to exist as a human being again.